people in the audience who are entrepreneurs? Keep your hands up. Keep your hands up if you have sold something to somebody. Okay? Keep your hands up if you have registered your business with an appropriate government agency. Keep your hands up if you have hired staff. Keep your hands up if you have, after all of this, made a profit. Keep your hands up if after all of this, you have grown your company by more than 100%. Okay. Now, here is what happens when you let researchers into your life. We want to talk about better questions before we want to talk about answers. So what you have just demonstrated is the effect of using one of any number of definitions of what is and is not an entrepreneur. Some of the literature considers an entrepreneur to be somebody who has made sales, period. Some considers anybody who has registered a company to be an entrepreneur. That's registration. Some literature considers that you have to have hired employees. Some of the global descriptions of entrepreneur assume that you have grown your company. Yet, the number of people who self-identified as entrepreneurs, the very first question I asked, that's a question that's really important. And what happens when, this is what happens when you let researchers into your life, we want to ask which one of those definitions are you actually using in order to try to talk about what happens when somebody wants to start a business. So, this is my guiding principle behind the idea for the psychology of entrepreneurship. I can tell you a story about how this title came about. In 1993, I was at the College of William & Mary in the psych department. I became interested in entrepreneurship, and at that time I also started, I'd actually had a couple of entrepreneurship publications by then. And I wanted to delve into entrepreneurship further. I wanted to be able to teach it. I'm in a psych department. William & Mary's got a business school. So I said, if I just call this entrepreneurship, the business school's going to object. However, if I call the course the psychology of entrepreneurship, they can't object and I can do what I want to. So that's where the title came from. And back then, you had to really scrounge to find any literature. Now there are at least 4 books, at least a dozen chapters, and well over 100 articles that deal with the psychology of entrepreneurial behavior. The first thing, again, this is another thing that happens when you let researchers into your room. The first thing we want to do is identify proper descriptions of variables that we're going to test. The second thing we want to do is start ruling out things that don't make any sense. One of the myths that doesn't make any sense is that entrepreneurs are born, not made. There are several reasons this myth does not make any sense. First of all, there is a genetic predisposition. Shane and Nicolau have shown that there is a component of entrepreneurial behavior that is supported by particular genetic makeup. They do this by studies of monozygotic and dizygotic twins. Now, in psychology, the study of mono and dizygotic twins has a long history. Some of the research in it is less well done than others, but everyone respects Robert Plomin's work on heritability of psychological factors, particularly intelligence. And Shane and Nicolau, okay, maybe I better shut this one off. You can shut this one off, thank you. Shane and Nicolau have the good sense to use Plomin instead of some of the other people. So there is a genetic component, but a component is not something that dictates behavior. And if we didn't need to know more, how many of you have heard of the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor? Okay, so GEM has shown for years that there are great variations across countries in entrepreneurship and in startups and in potential. And now ask yourself, if all human beings were essentially the same, and if entrepreneurs were all born, not influenced by culture, by friends, by family, by other factors in their lives, if there was nothing there but what people were born with, you would expect that the proportion of society A who ended up being entrepreneurs would be the same as the proportion of society B that ended up being entrepreneurs. And it's just not true. So they're not born. If they're not born, what does do it? Well, you have to start with the context in which the individual finds him or herself. So there is the nature of the economy in the country. There is government policy and regulation. I don't know how many of you saw the presentation on registration of businesses that shows how easy or hard it is to register a business online. Well, naturally, being from South Carolina, I looked to see how hard it was to register a business online because I know that from personal experience. Well, South Carolina has one dot. The only US state with fewer dots is Arizona, which has only half a dot. And you know, the scale goes up to like 8 dots. So if you want to register a business in South Carolina, you've got to go through a lot of work. If you want to register a business in Indiana, you don't. And so even on a fairly local level, government regulation can make a difference in entrepreneurial startups. Parents make a difference. It really helps to have an entrepreneurial parent. And it helps even more if that entrepreneurial parent is your mother rather than your father. There are gender role differences that affect entrepreneurial behavior and entrepreneurial startups. The work of Candy Brush and her colleagues at the Diana Project is really eloquent testimony to the variety of issues that are faced by women who care to start a business that are simply not faced by men who want to do the same thing. There are local norms and roles. As human beings, we actually care about what other people say to us and think of us. And we care particularly about what our friends say. We care particularly about what our family members say to us. So if our friends and family are against it, we're going to think twice about doing it. If our friends and family are very supportive, then we look around and we think, okay, we have some support and we'll try it. So you'll notice that we're not anywhere close to the psychology of entrepreneurship yet. except now. There is a major test of psychological propensities called the Big Five. And I could tell you how this was developed, but I think that's probably not appropriate for this setting. Basically, it's lexically developed. It's not developed on the basis of testing people. But the authors come up with 5 dimensions that are presumed to cover most general aspects of personality. Openness to experience, extroversion, conscientiousness, and agreeableness. What's the 5th? Anybody know? Neuroticism. Yeah, well, these 4 seem to be related to entrepreneurship. Neuroticism does not seem to be so. So in addition to, oops, I might not have pushed hard enough. Yes. In addition to the broad traits of personality, there are specific traits that have received a lot of attention. Achievement motivation being the oldest one from back in the 60s. Self-efficacy, based on the work of Albert Bandura, has received a lot of attention, particularly when it's talking about entrepreneurial self-efficacy. One of the things that is particularly interesting about self-efficacy is it's one of those few psychological variables on which you can order people in basically a broad normal distribution, but through training, you can push the distribution a little bit. There are very few aspects of personality that you can train people into or out of. So self-efficacy is one of the more interesting psychological characteristics that has been tied to entrepreneurial behavior. Risk propensity. Well, okay, I asked at the very beginning for those of you who are self-identified entrepreneurs to raise your hand. So right now, I'm going to ask you to do something else. If you are an entrepreneur, don't just raise your hand, stand up, please. Okay, now that you are standing, let me tell you that right outside, I have a helicopter that will take you to the nearest airfield where you will be able to skydive out of a plane. If you want to do that, stay standing. Boy, you really are on the edge. Okay. Thankfully, you know, you never know how this is going to work. Thankfully, some people sat down. So I can say that for not everyone does all risk look the same. There's financial risk, there's social risk, there's physical risk, there's monetary risk, there are all sorts of risks that people can take. And normally, yes, thank you, you can sit down now. Very well behaved. Yes? Oh, yes, thank you. It's virtual. Yes, the helicopter is virtual. Cue the helicopter, please. Okay, so not all risk is the same, and financial risk is a risk that can be managed. And even if we're talking about just financial risk, well, there is research to show that there is a difference between the perception of the degree to which an activity is risky and the willingness to undertake an activity of a given level of risk. So those two things together have to be considered if you're going to talk about risk as a property of people who are entrepreneurs. Locus of control. Locus of control is one of those great popular elements that is thought to affect entrepreneurial behavior. And one of the things that is interesting about locus of control is that it is supposed to be slightly different from entrepreneurial self-efficacy. It's just a thought about where your reinforcements come from. Do they come from outside yourself, or are they things that you produce for yourself? But locus of control is one of those things that does have a little bit of support in the literature, but it is much, much more easily found in public perceptions of entrepreneurial action than it is in the scientific literature. And in fact, the best data that we have in the US, which comes from the panel studies of entrepreneurial dynamics, and if you want to see more about that, just Google PSED, and you'll get it. If you look at that, the real advantage of the PSED, PSED1 compared a nationally representative sample of people starting businesses to a nationally representative sample of people who were not starting businesses, both samples collected at the same time. So, and both samples given quite a number of psychological questions, which actually makes the PSED almost unique among American databases. Small Business Administration lists 57 of them, 35 public, 22 private, and the PSED is the only one that has any psychological characteristics of the entrepreneur. Well, if you look at the differences between people who are in the comparison group and people who are in the process of forming businesses, on locus of control specifically, no difference. So maybe it is, maybe it isn't, maybe it depends on the nature of the question, maybe it depends on the nature of who is an entrepreneur who's being tested. Having some difficulty with personality variables, the field turned to cognitive variables, social cognition primarily, talking about the differences between the scripts and schemata held by people who are entrepreneurs as opposed to people who are not. And for example, one of the things that we really know about the way people think is that experts think differently from the way that novices think. An expert will have a much more highly differentiated cognitive structure for a particular topic on which that person is an expert. So, if you look at a show like one of these cooking shows that has worst cooks in the country kind of thing, and say, find the stove, find the range. And they're kind of looking, oh, well, let's see, I'm not sure what this looks like. That's a novice who has no concept, really, no differentiated concept of what happens in a kitchen. Then you take a chef, and the chef will want to know parts per million of various spices that can be added to a dish to make it taste different. Because that's how finely differentiated an expert's cognitive structure is. And this is one of the things that may very well be involved in the success of, we used to call them serial. We don't really like that terminology anymore. We call them habitual entrepreneurs. Well, it's a little too much like serial killer, right? So serial problem solver maybe, but that would also apply, never mind. So habitual entrepreneurs have learned from their prior experience, have developed more highly differentiated cognitive structures, are able to anticipate things that a novice entrepreneur is unable to anticipate, are able to think their way out of problems that, based on what they did before, whether it succeeded or failed, because they've recorded all that. And so they behave differently. This is why second and third time entrepreneurs are such easy targets for angel and VC investment, because the investors can be pretty sure that, okay, this is somebody who understands the game, who knows how to make mistakes and who knows how to recover from them, who knows how to avoid making mistakes. And in fact, if we're talking about the differences in cognitive structures of people who are entrepreneurs or are not, that leads you to the sort of, well, you know, what aspects of the brain light up when you ask an entrepreneur to perform behaviors that are related to being an entrepreneur? Unfortunately, neuropsychological study of entrepreneurial behavior is in its infancy. It unfortunately is not applied to its infancy. It's unfortunate that it's only in its infancy because it's so ridiculously expensive. Time on an MRI machine costs you about $1,000 a person. And that doesn't count the software that's necessary to clean the data, nor does it count the software that is necessary to analyze the cleaned data, nor does it count the neuropsychological consultants who are needed to interpret the results of the second output of the software. So it would not surprise me at all if there are, in fact, neuropsychological differences. And I've even tried to get the National Science Foundation to support a project to test perceptions of risk among novice and expert entrepreneurs while those folks were in an MRI machine. But of course, like many, that proposal was rejected, mostly by the people who really know what the inside of the brain is supposed to look like. I only know what it is supposed to act like on the outside. So there are behavioral tendencies, coming back to the outside. People who are entrepreneurs are better at problem solving, particularly of problems that are related to entrepreneurial business. One of the things that carries over, no matter where you are operating as an entrepreneur, is the old better to ask forgiveness than to beg forgiveness than to ask for permission. So did I ask the business school, can I teach a course like this? No, I didn't. So you can do it even in an organization like a university whose fundamental structure has not changed since the 12th century. So we're talking really hidebound, which may be why entrepreneurship programs seem to have a lot of trouble in universities. Universities are not uniformly happy with entrepreneurship programs. We just do wild and crazy stuff, and it drives the accountants nuts. If you're going to be a successful entrepreneur, you have to be a leader of people. You have to be able to convince people to follow you, whether those are investors, whether they are shareholders, whether they are your partners, whether they are your employees. So if you're a lousy leader, you're going to be a lousy entrepreneur. And part of the process of understanding what the people around you want is a certain degree of both self-monitoring and emotional intelligence. So without those two, you're kind of flying blind. Now, those two processes have not received a lot of attention in the entrepreneurship literature. What has received more attention is entrepreneurial persistence. Because, of course, what we really want to know, what do we want to know about entrepreneurs? We want to know who's going to succeed, and believe me, If we did know that, well, if I knew that, I wouldn't be standing here because I would be working for a venture capital company for a hell of a lot more money than the university pays me. Because venture capital companies, as selective as they are, still lose everything on 40% of their investments. At least so says the National Venture Capital Association. So they can't pick people, even though they try very hard. So at this point, kind of nobody can. And if you want to see another attempt to find out more about an entrepreneurial mindset, stick around for the next 2 hours. No shameless self-promotion here. Entrepreneurship requires work. But again, there's the old adage that an entrepreneur would much rather work 80 hours a week for him or herself than 40 for somebody else. Because, and of course, what you don't realize when you say things like that is, well, you're always working for somebody else. It's the 80 hours that are now being devoted to your customers. It's just not your boss. Your customers are your boss. Entrepreneurs need to pivot. They need to be able to change direction when they need to. They need to be able to adapt from setbacks, to be able to show the kind of resilience that will carry them forward even after they have encountered an obstacle. And the thing that got me into entrepreneurship in the first place was the attribution processes. Attribution is the set of theoretical principles that attempts to explain how people, ordinary people, explain behavior and events. There are internal attributions, attributions to the person. There are attributions to the external environment. I spent 25 years studying the attribution of responsibility and blame. And as far as I know, I'm the only person who's ever written a book on the attribution of blame. More shameless self-promotion, it's now really available again. I should have bought it. I missed an entrepreneurial opportunity. When it came out in 1985, I could have bought it for 120 bucks, which I did not have. I was a psych prof. And before it got reprinted, it was all the way up to 675. So, you know, the stock market may not have done that well in that time period. The interesting thing about the attributions made by entrepreneurs is they accept the responsibility for their failures. I could show you a stack of literature in psychology this high that basically says if people fail, they're going to deny it. They're going to run away from it. But not entrepreneurs. And so that just looked like a really interesting topic. And another kind of large comparison, psychology is full of theories about why people continue to do things at which they find success. Easy to explain. Why do people continue to do something at which they have already failed? Also, a very interesting psychological question. Now, finally, an aspect of adaptability that investors are certainly interested in is coachability. If I'm this person's mentor, is the person going to listen to me? If I'm the person's investor, is the person going to listen to me? How can I make sure that they pay attention to what I have to say, or am I just wasting my time? So these are all aspects of the psychological character of an entrepreneur. So, where do I think we should go from here? One of the things that I think we should do, and I'm living proof of that, is start talking about the entrepreneurial mindset. And I know you've heard a lot about that over the last several days, as opposed to an entrepreneurial personality. The difficulty with an entrepreneurial personality, in quotes, is that it assumes that there is only one of those. And you either have it or you don't. So we test you and we discover you either have it or you don't. If you have it, we say, oh, go be an entrepreneur. If you don't have it, we say, corporate job for you. Don't even try it. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Because personality is to some degree malleable, although it is defined as what's left over when you take everything else away, pretty much. But what we need to consider are the aspects of an entrepreneurial mindset that include personality, but also include other things besides just personality measures. So what we need is a way to identify dimensions on which entrepreneurs might differ from other people. We're all accustomed to two-dimensional objects, flat planes. We're all accustomed to three-dimensional objects. We get a little nervous when people start talking about 4 dimensions. But if you want to get a picture of that for your head, imagine a styrofoam block. That's 1, 2, and it's this high, so that's 3 dimensions. And there are bamboo skewers sticking into it. Those bamboo skewers are differential heights. So now we have a 4th dimension. You put flags on them that are different colors, and now you have 5. I can't take you much beyond 5. Sorry? Yes, smell, that would be good. So the flags could not, excellent, the flags could not only be different colors, they could smell different. Wow, cool. Has anybody got a, yes? You're just supposed to look at this block. You're not supposed to be grabbing the little flags, man. Any other ideas? I just told you you're not supposed to touch the things. I would say that that kind of includes touching. All right, so you can think in more than 2 dimensions. So now I want you to imagine an n-dimensional space. The problem with studying entrepreneurs has always been, well, there's so damn few of them. They're so unusual. How do we compare them to anybody else? Well, the answer is on dimensions that define all human beings. And all you look for is a place in this n-dimensional space where entrepreneurs tend to cluster and places where the rest of us tend to be found. And then you can talk about the differences between entrepreneurs and everybody else in a sensible way. So returning to where I started, in order to do any of this, you need very careful operational definitions. That's just science, folks, and there's no way to get around it. Because if you can't replicate something, you can't trust it. So you have to have really careful operational definitions, which are not conceptual definitions. So again, for example, the PSED has an operational definition of what is a firm. A firm is an entity that has, in the past 6 months, made enough money to pay its expenses, including salaries of the owners and managers, for 3 of those 6 months. That is a firm by the definitions of the panel studies of entrepreneurial dynamics. And it's a very important definition because the PSED is supposed to be studying people, not firms. So if you meet that definition, you're out. Nobody argues that that's a perfect definition of a firm. What it is perfectly replicable. So we have to have multiple designs, multiple studies using different operational definitions of the same concept in order to flesh out what really happens in the psychology of entrepreneurship. And for that, we need appropriate comparisons. Entrepreneurs versus managers just makes me tired. The difficulty with getting appropriate comparisons is it's very expensive because you have to have a selection criterion that is the same for the people who are entrepreneurs and the people who are not. And so, for example, again, I keep using the PSED because I've been living it for 20 years. Each data point in the PSED probably cost us over $2,000, which is not something you can just go do. You've got to have external funding of some sort for research like that. You can do surveys more cheaply. Certainly now you can. You should do panel studies. You should do experiments. A team from Scandinavia that includes good friends of mine is embarking on a study of entrepreneurial teams because, of course, as we know, plenty of entrepreneurial ventures are not started by individuals, they're started by teams. And even though we know that, and we know how important it is, it's only now that they have managed to get 90 incubators across Scandinavia to give them access to every team in the incubator for as long as the team is there, about once every 6 months. And what they're going to do, among other things, is examine the relationships among team members and what happens to the firm when a team member leaves or when a new team member comes. But again, this is tremendously detailed, expensive research that takes an incredible amount of time. The academic life is not like the Wall Street life. Our expectations are only about a year out. They're not every quarter. But, you can't start a project that requires more than 6 months of effort to get it going unless you have tenure. It's just that simple. Because you'll never be able to publish out of it early enough to make a difference. So what I think we need to do is more of sort of what we have done to this point, except with better definitions, better operations, more widely dispersed representative designs that take into account differences across national cultures and even within national cultures. I think that is pretty much it. I have a thing on the Kaufman website, behavioral determinants that you could read more of, I have several chapters on the psychology of entrepreneurship. You can reach me by email at that email address. And to conclude with shameless self-promotion, there are brochures in the back about my company if you want to take one. Do you have questions? Yes. Mr. Smell. What do you mean you want to be? You said you were in the beginning. I think it has to do with the recording because they're trying to record the sessions.
No problem. So because I train entrepreneurs, and in the first session within a 45 hours program, I talk about the entrepreneurial mindset. And like from the second session, I see people dropping out, or people telling me after the first session, now I am not sure if I am an entrepreneur, but I will keep on going with the program to know maybe I can become an entrepreneur. So I'm just asking if you can induce the mindset of an entrepreneur in someone who maybe want to start an entrepreneurial venture journey.
This is how I would answer that question. People who don't understand this whole process say, well, how can you teach entrepreneurship? This is somebody who would think that they were born. And to get out of that conversation as quickly as possible, I just say, well, what I can for sure teach them is how to become less likely to fail. So if you can start with this is what you would do to become less likely to fail, were you going to start? Or give them the opportunity to fail early, fail often, fail when there's no money on the table. I tell my business plan classes, this is where you're supposed to fail. Yeah, I know about lean startup. You go to a bank, they don't want lean startup, they don't want a pitch deck, they want a business plan. And you go to almost any other funder, they're gonna want a business plan. So if you really need to write one in the future, I don't want it to be the first one you ever wrote. So write the first one here. Make your mistakes here. I think, however, there is something to the self-selection because one of the things that I think all of us want to have happen is we want to encourage entrepreneurship in order to encourage economic growth. And economic growth is not helped by people who get investments and then promptly fail. That's money that could have been put to some other use better. So to some degree, I'm not concerned about self-selection. I think you can train people how better not to fail. You can certainly change their entrepreneurial self-efficacy. You can provide them with a supportive environment that they may not have had from their friends or family. And that may be enough to get them to go. In the back? Yes. Another troublemaker. Wait for the mic. Oh, yeah, but we got to have fun here, right?
Yeah, we got to have fun, yeah. My name's Chris Black from the Dynamic Business Startup Project. We've been training entrepreneurs for 20 years. Now, this field interests me. I can't even begin to tell you how much it interests me. So we noticed something very early on, and that is that if we did not go through some selection process in terms of selecting the students,
yes,
there was a really high dropout rate, and there was a very low business startup rate. So right back 19 years ago, we started to develop our entrepreneurial testing process. And we've got it to a stage right now where we've put it online. So a test of ours will take about an hour to do. But that's not, I don't want to get into that side of things too much. What I want to say is we've noticed that, this word entrepreneurship is bandied around a lot. Now, we've defined that there are two bands within this sphere of entrepreneurship. The one is the true entrepreneur, and that person just has an innate ability to be able to do, and a lot of the stuff you were talking about. The second band we've said is an enterprising individual. Now, that enterprising individual needs a fair amount of coaching, a fair amount of training, a fair amount of work done in order for them to be able to succeed in their business. So that the true entrepreneur, what I call the true entrepreneur, he will just, it's like a cat. You throw a cat.
He or she.
He or she, thank you. It's like a cat.
I have daughters. I'm really sensitive to this.
It's like a cat. You throw a cat from any height, and they have this innate ability to turn around and land on their feet.
Yes.
He or she. He or she cat.
I'm not concerned about cats.
So, yeah. So that's just been a little bit of our own personal journey with the whole thing. But it's an area that interests me incredibly greatly.
Wonderful. We should find a way to talk offline.
I'd love to. There is a third group that I'd like to mention, just for interest's sake. We've termed it the opportunist. And this is a person that can look you right in the eye, tell a bunch of lies, to such a degree is that they believe they are very believable. And I would like to find a lump of money to test, because I think that's where your criminal element sits. So,
well, I know a self-described billionaire who would fund that.
Just your comments on what I've said.
Yeah, that would be interesting too. Back when I was a psychologist, I taught a course called Social Psych and Law. And one of the things I learned in doing that was that when the US drug laws became more strict, suddenly the inmates' IQ on the average was higher than that of the guards. Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bertha from Cameroon. I'm happy to say I'm seeing the name Kelly Sheva today. When I went to the internet, I registered. It's my first time of coming to the GN Congress. I saw this thing about the mindset. In my community, there are women who are doing so much. Just what he has said, the different groups are enterprising women.
Yes.
There are those who will think they are entrepreneurs. There are others, he has said, they are opportunists. And this is because of the level of education, the environment, their mindset is quite different.
Oh, yes.
So I thought it wise to say I will start by changing the mindset. And I've already put on program on the 26th of July. I want to start changing the mindset of the women. In my community, we find the rural women doing so much from their farm products.
Yes.
Who don't have the education. They are doing so much at that level. Then you find the urban women who have the knowledge and the education and the money, but in the civil service. And the entrepreneurial mindset is very little. So just like what he was saying, if I had to start, maybe I will have the problem he just said, but I'm bent on starting, because when I came here, the first session I said I was going to attend was about the mindset, and today I am here. So I want to thank you so much.
Thank you.
But I would really love to know how actually to start.
Well, I began with a discussion, a very brief discussion of the sort of infrastructure that people need to have in order to embark on any entrepreneurial venture. I participated as part of a study that folks from Wake Forest did in Nicaragua. And the Sandinistas outlawed business pretty much. And so one of the questions on their survey was, is there a paved road in front of your business? Now, that's a level of infrastructure that, you know, many of us take completely for granted. And then there were, interestingly enough, there were other questions in that survey that were put there by a cultural anthropologist, questions about what you get from your church. So they asked questions about, did you get any training from the government? Did you get any training from a bank? Did you get any training from your church? Well, the answers respectively were no, no, and yes. Where do you get your employees? From people I know in church. So if you were going to go to Nicaragua and try to start an entrepreneurial support program, you'd do it through the churches. Forget the government, because that's where people congregate. So this whole, you know, we can talk about what's going on inside the person's head, but you've got to have the head in the right place first.
Hi, my name is Shemin Chetty. I'm from the Center for Entrepreneurship at Wits Business School. So I related to your comment about entrepreneurship in academia, and I see another colleague from another university here. So I want to raise, so this is interesting for me, and it's an area that we don't do a lot of work in terms of optimizing entrepreneurship in the country. But the other implication of what you're saying is, and another challenge that we're having, is creating a culture of entrepreneurship where we're encouraging younger people at schools. But a recent study has shown that the attributes of ADHD is very similar to entrepreneurship.
Yes.
And so
That would
our
be
kids
Johan
in
Wickland's
school,
stuff.
Yes, so the system is kind of putting them in boxes that are not
The wrong
supportive.
box.
Exactly. So it's more a comment and to kind of ask you, are there solutions around the world? I mean, listen, our challenges are a whole lot, but culture is a huge piece in terms of how we get entrepreneurship. We recognize it early, but we also get it to be a kind of first choice for people, rather a kind of choice where nothing else is working. And we're doing some advocacy work in that. So it'll be interesting to hear about possible solutions or how you've dealt with it, or if you have knowledge of dealing with such stuff.
You have just exceeded my capacity to provide any sort of rational answer. It's a wonderful question, and it's a huge problem. I don't know anything about it. There's a question in the back. Oh, there's a microphone over here. Then we'll go to the question in the back.
I think for me, the interest would be the mindset of an entrepreneur in an informal sector to a mindset in a person in an urban environment. Because especially in Africa, the informal sector is a big
Yes.
industry, and it survives through years and
Yes.
decades. And for me, I think the interesting part would be to source that data as to what kind of an entrepreneur actually survives and lasts so long, even within that informal sector.
Yes.
Because I think most of the time we tend to study the formal sector.
Oh, we study the people we can get hold of. The real problem with any informal economy is the researchers can't find them. The people who are in that community know each other, certainly, but if you are operating in the informal economy and you have some connection with any government agency, including a university, you're going to be worried that the registration people are not far behind.
I think my concern is that if they're so thriving and they're doing well and they're surviving and they're able to take them, I mean, I've seen others who have taken their kids to university and have survived over the years. If we convert them from informal to formal, are
Yes.
we then not killing the spirit? And those are the dimensions and factors that I'm wondering about.
I hope the next question is one I might be able to answer.
Good day, thank you very much. My name is Mlamu Limbambo. I do personal finance training. Predominantly, we've been doing it for young professionals in companies, and now I've kind of been moving towards also doing it for entrepreneurs. So my question is, in terms of their mindset, how do entrepreneurs differ from employees in terms of financial literacy, their personal finance? Because I find that incubators tend to focus on business finance and not on the personal finance element of it. Is it clear?
Yeah, thank you, please.
Vijay Bahadur from the Institute for Success. We incubate about 250 to 350 informal businesses, so we have access. Every one of our entrepreneurs must be investors in a mutual fund, index fund, unit trust, from as little as 500 Rand. So that's what we do and what we encourage. And we welcome you. If you want my details, I can share with you. One more thing before I go. I want to volunteer as an entrepreneur to work with you, because we have no platform where we can go at our level to say, these are the problems we're having, whether it's psychological, whether it's financial, whether we're blaming God to be black, white, etc., male, female.
Right.
So we don't have a platform where we at that level. I understand your informal question. All what the intellectual gentleman said is fine, but my entrepreneurs don't care about that. They believe that coaching and coachable is brainstorming, trying to get in the brain and change who they are, but we teach them to be coachable. I think that's the element we want to introduce. Thank you.
Thank you. There is a young woman over here who has been waiting to ask a question. She just moved from the back row. She's talking. I really want it to be your turn to ask a question. Oh, fair enough. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Anuja, and I'm from Chilisoft. I am an entrepreneur, and I've run 2 software businesses. And I think your studies are very interesting, but what I wanted to know is, do you study the mindset of a corporate person? Because I think the problem with perception is the perception of success. And often as an entrepreneur, you are judged by the metric of financial, a financial amount. An entrepreneur defines success differently.
Yes.
And also we spoke about the cultural aspect. So if you're going to change society to allow entrepreneurship, then somebody should study why businesses think that we should all be Silicon Valley companies to be successful.
Yes. Yes. Well, success is another one of those concepts that needs a lot more careful operational definition. And part of the issue is that success to the entrepreneur as a person may not be success to people on the outside. So, for example, take somebody from the informal economy who is managing to create enough wealth to support a family. Now, a lot of people who have the Silicon Valley view of the world would think that's not just a waste of time, it's a failure, it's just not worth talking about. From the perspective of that entrepreneur, however, I'm doing okay. Now, I might want to do better, but the difference is that when we start talking about what contributes to entrepreneurial success, then we really have to talk about whether the success is as defined by somebody externally or as defined by the entrepreneur, him or herself.
It's defined externally because you're living within an ecosystem. So you're not in isolation. So the factors and the aspects that we interact with on a daily basis, you have judgment,
Yes.
pity.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
You start off your engagement where somebody's feeling sorry for you, like really?
Yes.
I'm more educated and more qualified and more competent than most business people that I meet.
Yes.
And yet, Because we're a 37-person company, okay, we regard it as small. So
Well,
it's those
what
definitions that
what-
affect success
the people,
impacts on us.
are you in the US?
No, actually, I'm South African.
Okay. Because in the US, you would be half again bigger than 85% of the firms in the US. 85% of the firms in the US are fewer than 20 people.
But it's the culture of saying, you're an entrepreneur, so you're small, so you're informal, so you need education. You know, and I have a problem with that.
As you should. As you should. I think actually we're really out of time. Well, take one more, but then we really should probably move on. If they've shut the mic off, we're done. Thank you all for coming.